Hello, my name is Elliot Carey, and this is my presentation for the Professional Collaboration module of the MA in Production at Bath Spa University. My focus for this presentation is on integrative and innovative production. Integrative and innovative production describes an approach to sound engineering that takes into account a revised personal profile of the artist. It involves getting to know the artist as an integral part of the recording process. My MA dissertation studied the effects of social media on self-esteem of musicians and discovered that there was a link. The symptoms of this showed artists who struggle with self-esteem often compare themselves to others, overthink and undermine their own true potential as an artist. This style of production has been developed with techniques aimed at bypassing these symptoms in order to nurture the self-esteem of an artist and provide the greatest performance possible. Some of these techniques include coming up with rules for the studio and generating appropriate atmospheres. As well as this, I will be focusing on environment as a key production tool. Generating the right environment and exploring different venues for recording is important as it allows you to see where the artist you are working with records best. I'll now introduce the three artists that I work with for this module. The first artist that agreed to work with me for this module was a Riot Girl band from Bristol called Gauze. The guitarist from Gauze, whose name is Rat, approached me when they heard I was into experimental production. As a band, they are a ferocious example of the Southwest DIY punk scene, but with an added element of industrial noise and even more in-your-face concepts than most of the bands I know from Bristol. They put an immense amount of time and effort into building props and outfits for their live shows in order to make things more exciting. While they are a band first and foremost, they also delve into a multitude of different creative projects. For Gauze, I will be producing a single called Five Finger Discount, which in its truest essence is a song about shoplifting. Secondly is Stan Elliot, a singer-songwriter from Bath, UK. I first met Stan around 5 years ago and briefly played in his band as a drummer. Since then, I've only vaguely been in touch with him a few times, but I've always kept up to date with his music. He is an incredible songwriter, focusing mainly on jazz and R&B, but for live shows has a number of funk and rock and roll tracks to get his audience dancing. Since meeting him, his writing style has matured massively, but he still maintains his older songs and constantly improves them if and when he learns new techniques. I will be producing a single for Stan called Doubting Around, which is a song that touches upon the theme of self-esteem and self-doubt. Thirdly is Alternative Milks, which is a band I have played in for around 3 years. The project was formed from ideas penned by its frontman Michael Jordan, while he was sofa surfing at my flat. We play a mix of different genres, all the way from post-punk to country, and live we often change the energy of our songs to be louder and faster to create a fun live show. The ethos of the band is to never put anything we do inside a box and always be open to change. For Alternative Milks, I'll be engaging in the first recordings for our first album, titled Average Sandwich. Mike's wish was to have the album complete before his 30th birthday, and so I decided to start the process of recording the album for this module as he turned 29 in April this year. I had only ever worked collaboratively with people I knew until this point, and often not as the project's leader. Even though I had no intention on leading a project for any of my artists in this module, and wanted to serve only as a guide in the production process, I had to find a method of organisation that worked for me as an individual, so that I could at least keep track of my recording sessions. For this I used Google Calendar. Google Calendar provided an interactive and straightforward interface to help me organise my artists via colour codes. The calendar is also shareable, meaning my artists could see my availability and upload theirs. I also use Google Drive and open drives for each band so that we could share files easily. Sometimes I might have a .wav file that needs to be sent to them for them to add to a project, or vice versa, and Google Drive enabled this to be streamlined. As well as this, I made checklists that helped me keep track of track completion. The checklists meant I could view what we had done and what still needed to be done. The checklists were also shared with each artist so they could add elements themselves if they wanted to. This meant that halfway through a track's completion, if they decided that they wanted to add a synth part, they could add this to the checklist and I could see at my end. In order to contact band members, I used group chats. I made most of my group chats on WhatsApp with permission of my artists. I find the interface of WhatsApp is easier to use and more versatile than other chat applications. My first approach for each artist was to go and see them perform live. I believe live performances are a vital starting point to the production process for a producer. Performances give you an insight into a band's dynamic, the equipment that they use, and their skills as a musician. I take notes at each live performance. For example, at Stan Elliot's show, I noticed that he dropped his guitar pick and didn't have a spare, so I made a note to bring spare equipment for the studio sessions just in case. With Gauze, I noted that during playing a song, the whole band ends up playing at different tempos due to the sheer energy that they put into a live performance. My notes from this was in regards to how they may be more suited to live shows in venues due to the audience being there and the energy that they're surrounded by, and may not find that same energy in a studio space when they're recording. This is just an example of how an artist's live performance can benefit a producer. I'm now going to detail 8 of the recording sessions that took place over this module. These sessions have been ordered into types of recording that show the integrative and innovative approach discussed in my introduction. I will begin with my first 2 sessions, one with Stan Elliot and another with Alternative Milks. These sessions show how rules and pressure can affect the recording process. Mike and I arranged to meet and begin the process of recording the album by focusing on bass. We liked the bass tone in the demos Mike had made for the band, so didn't really feel we needed a studio in order to record. The first process we went through was to sit down and listen to the demos, as there are already lots of tracks for the album with great bass lines. After about an hour of listening, we realised that around half the album's bass tracks were good enough to be considered done, and so we only felt that 5 to 6 bass lines were needed in order for us to check bass off the list for the entire album. During the recording process, Mike felt like he was overcomplicating some of the bass lines, even though they had previously been recorded. We only wanted to improve them slightly and not turn them into something else entirely. For this, we generated 2 rules. Rule 1, focus simplicity for an entire take. Rule 2, in specific 4 or 8 bar segments, you can improvise as much as you like. These rules serve as a guide to prevent any overthought of bass parts and ensure there was a solid bass line running through the entire track at the very least. The second rule specifically meant that we could still add in additional improvised parts to add interest to the track without the bass line becoming too prominent. The process of deciding when something is done can be a challenge for any artist. This session showed that acknowledging your own strengths and accepting them can be a benefit. Because we had decided to leave certain bass recordings from the demos as finished takes for the album, it meant that within a single session, bass for the entire album was completed. I arranged with Stan to meet at my flat to record guitars in my hallway as my first session with him. I felt like as a first recording session with Stan, this would be the right environment as it was comfortable and familiar. I had already set up a space with microphones and a stool for Stan to sit on. My makeshift control room was set up in my bedroom. With the door to my room shut, Stan could still hear me speak, but also had a separate space for him to record in. I felt like for our first recording together, having him play right next to me while I watch probably wasn't the best approach, so giving him his own space felt like the right thing to do, to get him into the groove. After around 5 successful takes, I noticed that Stan was beginning to overthink what he had already recorded, which to me was nothing short of perfect. He wanted to overdub certain sections, and even though we went through with this, I noticed that he was trying to harmonise parts that he'd already laid down, instead of tightening them up. Instead, I suggested we switch instruments from acoustic to electric guitar to give us a break. I explained a technique that I used when trying to balance the composition of an abstract painting back on my fine art degree years ago. The technique involves contrasting a mark as much as possible with the following mark. For example, a large opaque red mark followed by a small transparent yellow mark. The rules of this technique are not strict, but Stan seemed to like the idea of contrasting what he'd already done with a new instrument. So far we had a lot of dry acoustic tracks, so we used a lot of delay and reverb on the electric guitar to contrast it. During the recordings, I noticed Stan was going for very technical improvised parts and struggling to nail them. I suggested a rule where he can only play 3-note chords in order to simplify the parts. We worked well under this rule, but soon Stan had to go as he realised his car parking ticket was about to expire. I suggested that he do one final take and discarded the rule for this take. To my surprise, and also to his, he played a perfect take with really interesting improvised parts from start to finish. Although he had to leave quickly, we both acknowledged how pressure can sometimes be of benefit to certain musicians. Next, I'm going to discuss recording sessions that involve environments set up specifically for an artist's style of playing. The first session I'm going to talk about is a session where we recorded Fender Rhodes for Stan's track, Doubting Around, with his keys player Max. Max had shown his excitement at the idea of playing a studio Fender Rhodes, so I decided to design this session around his excitement. I set up 2 clean amplifiers in a wide stereo position behind the Fender Rhodes. I used a lovely sounding Fender Vibrasonic with the reverb and vibrato on. The wide stereo positioning meant that the room filled with this beautiful Fender Rhodes sound. The positioning was done on purpose so that Max would hear and feel the full effect of the amplifiers instead of only being able to hear a single amplifier through his headphones. He immediately took a liking to the sound, and I feel he really enjoyed the experience of playing a Rhodes in a room that engulfed him with this sound. Max is a very skilled keys player, so I had no worries about his abilities in the studio. Stan wanted the Rhodes to be a main instrument in the song, as he felt the song needed it to glue it together. With this in mind, I made sure Max had a limited number of guide instruments in his headphone mix. He was happy with drums, guitar, and vocals, This meant that he could hear what he was playing and also hear what that was doing dynamically in the song as he was recording it. After doing 2 perfect runs of the track, we decided to focus on improvised parts. Because the whole sound of the Rhodes had already been recorded, we noticed that any double-ups of bass notes down the lower end of the keys added too much mid-range to the whole recording. In order to combat this, I used a rule. I put a piece of yellow tape in the centre of the keyboard and told Max he was only able to play on the right side of the tape with his right hand. This resulted in sweeps of twinkly Rhodes pieces that flowed over the whole recording without making any of the mid-range or low-end muddier. When working with Max, who is very skilled with our instrument, I felt quite excited by the rules I made, as watching him adapt his skill set to a new challenge was just as exciting for me as it was for him. The second environment, similar to the one set up for Max's Rhodes recording, was a session I set up for Rat, Gauze's guitarist. I had previously spoken to Rat about their noisy synths and stomp boxes that I had noticed them using at the live show. We discussed our love for heavy noise and feedback, and I suggested we do a session solely focusing on this. I set up a studio session and arranged for them to come along with as many toys as they could bring to make sound with. The idea behind the session was to give Rat a completely unrestricted environment for them to make as much noise as possible without having to adhere to a pre-written track or project. This session focused on performance and being in the moment. I designed the session so that Rat had a 4x12 cabinet and prime place for feedback augmentation. I raised the gain on the amplifier so that feedback was more likely to occur. This meant that they could have total control over the sound, using their guitar volume pots or volume pots on their effects chain. I feel that Rat truly lent into this recording session as a moment to explore a type of sound that they enjoy. I said to Rat that they were in charge of the lengths of recordings and that they could play for as long as they liked. We completed 2 10-minute long noise pieces and then a smaller one before changing over to different equipment. For Gauze's single, I intended to build the track out of samples from different recordings in the same way producers make dance music. This idea came to me as a way to keep a dance-like rhythm going throughout the track, whilst making sure all parts are in time with each other. This noise session with Rat generated a large amount of samples that could be used in place of guitar feedback in the song. For these next 2 types of recording session, I'm focusing on site-specific recording. This first session involved recording guitars for 5 Finger Discount during a live DIY punk show at a skate park in Bristol. Gauze had mentioned the show to me when we first met up to chat, and I've been trying to think of ways to capture some recordings there. I decided to record guitars. Since the beginning of the process, recording 5 Finger Discount, I noticed that the entire band performed far more confidently when in front of an audience. The venue itself seemed to play a role as well, as this DIY punk show brought with it an energy that lined up perfectly with Gauze's aesthetic. The atmosphere at the Daveside show was so exciting to witness as it encapsulated a subculture. I felt I'd made a good choice in recording them here, as I knew the performance would be spectacular, and it was. The setup for the show was also very DIY, with everything being powered by a small petrol generator. I brought with me a portable studio and set up my microphones during Gauze's changeover and line check. I tried to remain out of their way as they set up, as I didn't want to infringe upon their set time. The setup was very fast-paced, and I had to be prepared, so I set most of my equipment up beforehand and was ready to record in around 10 minutes. While Gauze made their way through their set, I balanced my microphones and hit record before 5 Finger Discount started. Luckily, I'd brought with me extra long XLR cables, otherwise I wouldn't have been able to reach the amplifiers with my microphones as the stage was in front of a giant concrete ramp. Gauze had put me in contact with the event organiser, but they were far too busy to respond on the day to questions about equipment, so I packed extras just in case, and I'm very glad I did. This method of audio recording was extremely exciting, as there was a rawness to the music that I don't feel could be replicated in the studio. Gauze played a lot harder at this show than they did at the one I previously attended. As well as this, the general DIY nature was something that I threw myself into, and I really enjoyed the process. Although guitars needed editing to match them up with the track's original tempo, I was more than happy to do this in order to preserve the moment. We liked the idea of the single having multiple elements from different live shows, as well as elements recorded in the studio and other places. Here's a video showing my setup for the Daveside show. It's pretty rocky, but there's the first amplifier with the first microphone. And then over here is Kit's amplifier, the small orange. I have a DI leading from the bass right round the back to where I've set up my mini studio on the rocks. Another example of site-specific recording is a saxophone session we did for Stan Elliott's Doubting Around. I met up with Stan and spoke to him about recording saxophone in a natural reverb space. His saxophonist Oscar used to play saxophone in public during lockdown and capture the natural reverb of a different space as he played in it. He'd often play at night when no one was around. We recorded at Midford Tunnel, which is just outside of Bath, where Stan and his band grew up. The tunnel is also next to the church where Stan's grandparents were married, and so there's a subtle amount of significance to the space that personalises the sound for Stan. The tunnel had a relatively short decayed reverb, which was a perfect, natural reverb for saxophone. Oscar already knew the main parts of the song, but we discussed the idea of letting the space guide the parts. The tunnel acted almost as a slapback delay effect to the saxophone, which in the mix made it stand out as a solo part. Once we did a few takes, we recorded some improvised parts, and I noticed that Oscar was holding notes for longer and playing louder in order to get the most out of the tunnel. The difficulties with this space, however, was that it was a public bridleway, and so a couple of the recordings had to be restarted due to cyclists or runners going past the microphones. The final take even featured a barking dog. Finally, I'm going to talk about sessions that took place in a professional studio. These sessions are focused more on me as a producer monitoring my own insecurities within this environment. For Stan's vocal recording, we decided to use the studio as I had a booking available. I'd never recorded vocals in a studio before, so I was apprehensive about my abilities within the session. I decided to go for 2 different microphones with the idea to swap them halfway through the recording session, so that I had 2 different microphone takes to compare and choose from. What I didn't take into consideration was that a vocalist like Stan goes through various stages of warming up during the process of singing. Stan had a warm-up exercise that he did before we began recording. After about 3 takes, I swapped the microphones and I immediately preferred the sound. However, by this point, Stan's voice had become far louder and he had lost some of the raspiness in his voice as a result. This meant that the first verse, which is much softer vocally, was closer to what Stan wanted for that section, but was recorded with the first microphone. But for the rest of the song, Stan preferred the second microphone. Unfortunately, the 2 microphones were far too different in quality for me to make them sound consistent together. This was a mistake on my part, as my own insecurities got in the way of a solid recording. However, having learnt from this experience, I spoke to Stan after about redoing the recording back at my flat where we first began, and he agreed this would be a much more relaxing environment for the vocal take. During the recording, Stan really struggled to hit a specific high note at the end of a song. I suggested we take a break and think about how he's going into the section to see if there's anywhere he can reserve some energy for the take. He tried a few more times but couldn't quite get there. He said his voice didn't feel strained, so I provided support by standing next to the control room window and gesturing to encourage him as the difficult part came up. Eventually, he nailed the part. This session was an interesting one, as there were moments where both of us needed a bit of support and guidance. It allowed me to see a collaborative process between the artist and producer as a special relationship where both of you were learning at the same time. The studio session with Gauze was incredibly interesting and overall a really fun experience. The session was intended to record drums, but Mason, Gauze's bassist, came along anyway just in case we had time to record bass as well. I decided we should record both at the same time and set up a DI box in the control room that ran through Mason's effects chain. This way we saved time and got 2 performances in one. After getting set up in the room, we did some run-throughs with the guide track, and Mason realised that the guide track was faster than the original tempo of the song. As the guide track was taken from a live performance, due to them not having a demo of the track, there wasn't much I could do there and then to fix that issue. So I set up a guitar for Rat and got them to play along with Mason and Jem as a physical guide. The next issue was that, without the guide, they were worried they wouldn't have the vocal cues they needed to discern the song structure. However, they managed to nail the song in a couple of takes without the guide vocals, showing to them that they knew the song more than they thought that they did. Having the rhythm section recorded was vital, as it formed the basis of a song structure, meaning I could then start adding in other samples from other recordings to build the track. This presentation detailed examples of recording sessions which highlighted my ethos as a producer. My focus as a producer is to provide an artist with an environment that nurtures their sense of self-esteem and allows them to freely express themselves. The most important part of engineering music is the artist's performance, and so I believe the most work needs to be done in order to capture the best performance possible. Within the types of recording I've explored, I've learnt a number of lessons. Firstly, environment is incredibly important. While the studio environment is designed to capture great performances, there are other venues out there that give different possibilities to a recording. For example, the energy of a live show compared to the energy of a studio performance. Secondly, Every single artist is unique and will respond very differently to these environments depending on how they interact with being perceived by an audience, should there be an audience or not. I believe it is an important practice to mix up the recording venue for different instruments where possible to help diversify a recording. The integrative process of production involves learning about your artists as musicians and people alike. I believe that while this style is not necessary in order to obtain a successful career in production, it is a great advantage when trying to establish a relationship with an artist. Trust is incredibly important in the recording process. The artist needs to trust that their work is in the right hands. I feel that the integrative approach ensures this trust from the beginning, as it involves you personally in their work. With every recording comes a new challenge. Challenges, I believe, are crucial for a sense of true creativity. Not only do challenges provide a scope for adjustment for both the artist and the producer, but they sometimes lead to creative mistakes. The challenges faced in this module were all in regards to overcomplication, overthinking, and self-doubt. Key themes that are pertinent to some of the artists that I've recorded are definitely key themes behind my own ethos as a producer. Engaging with this process has been interesting, as it is the first time I've truly been able to experiment and collaborate with others at an equal level. I've opted to have creative control over mic placements, recording techniques, and rules within the studio, and the artists I've worked with responded incredibly well to these ideas. I also learnt a lot myself from working with these individuals. I now feel I know my way around a mixing desk in a way I didn't before this module. My general level of confidence and self-esteem has vastly improved since working with others. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.